Alright, so before we dive into async await, let's go ahead and refamiliarize ourselves with promises again. I'm going to create a simple function that returns a promise. So let's do this as function myPromise value return new promise resolve reject. And let's resolve this promise with a string. So our first example, and we'll give it a variable here with value in it. And we'll go ahead and consume this promise below. So we'll do promise, we'll say A. Then result, we'll log it out to the console. All right, looks like it's good. So what we have here is a function called myPromise that receives one parameter that we're calling value. This function returns a promise that is resolved with a string that has example1 and our value that we've passed. Next, we invoke our function below, pass it a string for our value parameter. Since our function is returning a promise, then when it's resolved, we're console logging out the result. This is a fairly simple example because we're resolving the promise immediately. We're not doing anything asynchronous like fetching data from a server or using setTimeout. Let's go ahead and convert our example here to use async await. I'm going to create a new function called myAsync Function. As you may have noticed in the last part, an async function consists of an async keyword at the beginning of the function name and the await keyword inside the function. I'm going to pretty much mimic the first example, but use 2 instead of 1 and use B instead of A. Alright, so that works. Let's go ahead and look at why. In our first example, we created a function that returned a promise. This promise resolved with a string with our value in it. We invoked our function below, passed it a value, and then console logged the result. In our second example, we created an async function using the async keyword and the await keyword. We then continue to invoke our promise like our example above, and then we use our then keyword to console log out the result. So the first point I would like to make about async await is that it doesn't replace promises. In fact, it uses promises under the hood and is why we're able to use the then method to log out our value. Another point is that when you're inside an async function and you return something, it wraps it in a promise. In my example above, I'm returning the await keyword, but we could assign it a value and return that instead, and it will still be wrapped and returned as a promise. Because async await uses something resembling a generator in the background, you can think of an async function as an isolated place to do asynchronous tasks synchronously. The await keyword replaces the then method and can be assigned a promise or another value type. Await waits for the thing on the right to resolve before moving to the next line. So we can await multiple segments of code in an async method to replicate what we might do with then chaining. Again, each await will wait for the value on the right to resolve before moving to the next line. If the value on the right is a promise, then it will wait for it to resolve just like the then method. Alright, so essentially an async function will await values until it returns a promise in the end. Since it returns a promise, we can consume it as a promise with a then chaining, or we can consume it with another async method. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. I'm going to create a function called consume async function. Easy enough, right? And what this function is going to do is it's going to utilize the myAsync function from above. We'll pass it a C for the parameter, and we're just going to log it out. So since our myAsync function returns a promise, when it is ran, our await keyword can go ahead and wait for that, assign it to result. Once it's done, we can console log it. Alright, so now to invoke our consume async function. So it looks like it's working. So let's quickly review the inner workings of an async function. We first append the async keyword to a function. This allows us to use the await keyword inside the function. The await keyword can be paired with a number of values, but most importantly, a promise. Once the promise is resolved, it can move down to the next line. Remember, an async function always returns a promise, so you can consume it using the promise then chain or another async function like we did below.